All right, so we've reached week 5 of this class. Still a little bit behind. I'm hoping to get what I had planned for this week, the last section of what is crime, and start to get into the police um, module of the class. If I don't get there, I do have about a cheat week built into the semester. I mean, I'm always running behind. I always talk more than I should. So this week we're going to talk about how we measure crime. I'm going to talk things about like the Uniform Crime Report, which is very important because we see these reports that crime is up, crime is down, these things are going on, and it's an important question: is how do we get numbers? How are they gathered? How reliable are they? It's estimated that anywhere in some categories, 50% of crime is not reported. So we're going to talk about some of the ways the federal government measures crime. We're going to talk about crime trends, of how some crimes are increasing, some crimes are decreasing. We're going to talk about how crime statistics show disparities on racial, ethnic, and economic lines, both as the offenders and the victims. And to some extent, crime, people tend to commit crime where they live, close to where they normally are. So their victims tend to be, in majority of cases, their neighbors. And we'll talk about as the statistics show, that is definitely true. And then we're going to talk about the theories of why people commit crimes. I'm going to be fairly brief. That is, it's not something you need to put a ton of thought into. I'm not going to have questions on a lot of questions or deep questions on the exam on the theories of crime. I'm going to leave that to when you take criminology, and you'll do a lot deeper dive into the various theories of why people commit crimes. Quick reminder, we do have our Zoom on Wednesday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. I have had some people show up. It's definitely something that if you have the ability, especially as we start getting closer to exams, I tend to give away exam questions sometimes. And I also have my optional Thursday evening, 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. We should talk somewhat about the midterm exam. I have it scheduled on the schedule for week 8. That is the week before spring break. So that would be the week ending, I believe, on March 20th. I did think, wonder if maybe we could postpone it a week. I would give it to you maybe the Wednesday before spring break, and it would be due like the Tuesday after spring break. Probably I'm looking maybe 30 to 40 questions, maybe one long answer question, which you have to answer maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs. Mostly it will be multiple choice, fill in the blank, or true and false. So if you have any strong feelings on maybe pushing it up a week, you can just drop me an email, shoot me a text, or just write something in your discussion for the week if you have any strong feelings on that. If not, I would give it to you at the beginning of week 8. Probably I'd put it out on Monday and have it due on Friday. All right, so let's talk about how we measure crime in the United States.
So the primary tool we use in the United States to measure crime is what's called the UCR, or Uniform Crime Report. You'll hear people talk about UCR data. You see them talking about things on TV. It's usually they're talking about UCR data. It's maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. It comes from theoretical mandatory reporting of certain crime data from every police agency in the United States. That's not necessarily happening. Some agencies are so small they don't report. Some agencies underreport intentionally. Some agencies misreport because they don't understand the definitions, and their definitions in their state may not meet the federal definitions. There's a whole bunch of reasons why there's errors in that data set. You can go into that information and see by region, by area, where the crime is occurring. You can get demographics of the offender. You can see how many crimes were reported, how many were cleared, which means they're arrested. It's broken down. There's 8 what we call index crimes, part 1. There's 4 violent crimes, 4 property crimes, and then there are part 2 offenses, which pretty much is everything else. The part 1 data is probably better than the part 2 data. You tend to see them report UCR data in a percentage of 100,000 people. Obviously, if you live in a small community like I do in Leverett, which is about 1,800 people, say you have a single murder, that is going to give you an astronomical murder rate per 100,000 people. So obviously, the larger your community, the more accurate that information is. And it can generally tell you whether your crime is rising or falling. There are some issues with that, as we'll see. So these are the part 1 crimes. Homicide, robbery, sexual assault, and aggravated assault are the part 1 crimes against people. Part 1 crimes against property or burglary, larceny, auto theft, and arson. So these are the definitions. I'll leave them up here for a little while. You'll notice it doesn't say murder. It says homicide, the willful non-negligent killing of a human being by another. Sexual assault, as opposed to rape, more general and wide ranging definition. Robbery. Aggravated assault, this is the one that tends to sometimes cause a lot of problems because some states don't have an aggravated assault statute. We did not really have one until relatively recently in Massachusetts. Some of the things we consider an aggravated assault does not fall under this definition. An example would be an assault and battery occurring in violation of a restraining order would constitute aggravated assault in Massachusetts, but does not meet the federal definition for aggravated assault. These are the property crimes for them. All right, so this is just a short list of part 2 crimes, basically all other offenses. If it's not in part 1, it's in part 2. Crazy ones like they list, this came right off the Department of Justice's website. Display of any other flag other than the United States. Contributing to delinquent with a minor, contempt of court, possession of an air rifle by a juvenile, kidnapping, pretty serious crime that falls under part 2 offense. All right, this is a kind of simple flow chart that came from your text, which we can use to see how UCR data is generated and how it may be incomplete. So a crime is committed. We have a decision point where the victim or a witness may not report it to the police, or the police may become aware of it in some other way. Police may be patrolling, see that someone has cut all the locks off a storage unit. That actually happened in Greenfield the other night. They had one of the storage units, somebody cut into I think it was 10 storage units. Guy on patrol found the locks cut off. There are several reasons why a victim or witness may not report the crime. Domestic violence is horribly underreported as a crime. They may not feel it's something they need to bring to the attention of the police. It could be that they're not even aware they're a victim of a crime. Say they left their car unlocked. A bunch of kids were walking around the neighborhood trying doors. Hey, door's open. They go in and steal some change. Um, the owner of the car gets in the car next morning. I'm like, I need a quarter for, I don't know, quarters. I must have used them all. They're a victim of crime. They just don't even know it. Um, People may not report because they don't really like the police. So we lose a lot of actual crime right there. The second decision-making point is by the police. I mean, they may not think it is a crime. Crimes have certain definitions. It could be the officer is lazy and they kind of, I'll document it, but I won't put it in as a crime, so I don't want to do the work. There may be incompatible definitions. They may code it as something that doesn't get reported as like a Part 1 crime. So not all crime actually gets reported into the UCR. All right, a couple other things in UCR which cause underreporting or misreporting is one is the hierarchy rule. Under the hierarchy rule, police departments are instructed only to report the most serious crime that occurs during an incident. So the book uses an example of somebody stealing your bike. You go out and they assault you and injure you. The most serious crime is an aggravated assault. That larceny isn't getting reported. Some other incidents, you can lose important data. Say you had a rape murder. The murder is going to be the most serious crime, so that rape is not being included in the crime stats. The other thing is UCR is supposed to be being replaced by something called NIBRIS, which is National Incident-Based Reporting System. It's fairly similar. It just has more crime categories. It does eliminate the hierarchy rule. They break it into Group A and Group B crimes. There are 46 crimes in Group A. So it's more inclusive and may give us some better data. Still, victim unreporting and police underreporting are going to be an issue because they don't eliminate that. Supposedly 2021, next year, several months, this is going to be taking place. Still not a lot of agencies. I think they were at somewhere in 50% a couple of years ago reporting NIBRIS data. So another important tool we have is the National Crime Victimization Survey. This gives us a fairly accurate representation of the true crime numbers in the United States. Numbers tend to be very, very different than we're getting on UCR. There are several reasons for this. How this works is they first came about this in 1973. They go out and ask a randomized sample of people all across the country of their experience as victims of crime in the last 6 months. Some of the numbers are pretty interesting. Like if you look on page 47, page 2 or table 2.2. In 2016, UCR reported violent crime as 2.2 million. The National Crime Victimization Survey set it at 5,749,000. Significant difference. Property crimes were almost double. UCR said there was 7.9 million. The victimization survey set it at 15.9 million, about half underreported. There are some issues regarding this method. People may report something that happened outside of the that 6-month period. Say they had a very traumatic break-in, entry, and all their stuff was stolen. Maybe it was 8 months. They may tend to report that. So that tends to maybe add to a little bit of over-reporting. People may be embarrassed and not report certain types of crime to the interviewers. Um, there's also a definitions issue here. Like something like what people generally consider, they come home, their house gets broken into, they call 911 and say, I've been robbed. In reality, that's a burglary. Yes, they are provided with definitions of those crimes, but I think there's still going to be some bias there of what they consider to be a crime. They may self-report things that would not be considered a crime by the police. They're kind of left to their own devices as defining the definition. It leaves out homicide. Obviously, somebody who has been murdered cannot be self-report that they've been murdered. Commercial crimes, crimes on people under the age of 12 are not being caught by this. It definitely creates a higher level of crime. So another way of measuring crime is self-reporting studies. This is mostly for on the offender side. It's a really good way to get information on people that are committing offenses. You can get into demographic information like family members, their family situation, economic status, possibilities, things such as if they were sexually abused when they were younger. Some of the criticisms are that they may not get to everybody in a demographic. These are particularly used in adolescent populations, and they usually administer them in schools. So you'll tend to miss people that either have dropped out of school or maybe in a juvenile detention setting. So you're really not getting a good cross section. They also have questions whether the respondents are truthful. They also tend to ask about not only have you committed a crime, and they usually don't like just name the crime, they describe it. And they also ask about frequency. They have found that the frequency tends to be less reliable than the actual prevalence or whether they committed that crime. People may forget how many times they committed a particular crime, say drug use or a small minor property crime. It's also not as good at predicting and looking at more serious crimes because they tend to be less frequent in their occurrence. So self-reporting studies, you obviously get some information you're not going to get some other ways. All right, as we get to the end of the section on measuring crime, the book delves into the differences in rates of involvement in the criminal justice system along racial, ethnic, gender, and age lines. It's long been known that young males of all racial and ethnic groups tend to have the highest rates of involvement in the criminal justice system and tend to commit the most crimes. Some of the reasons, because they've studied this a lot, are biggest one is incomplete brain development. Young men tend to make poor decisions, not be able to see the consequences of their action, and just can't make a good decision. Women tend to mature earlier. I'm not gonna be a hypocrite. I did some stupid stuff when I was younger that I severely regret doing. Some of the other reasons they talk about is inadequate parenting, peer pressure. Hey dude, let's go do this. When I was about 14, 15, it was spray painting buildings. Really, really dumb. Talk about hormonal genetic reasons, male peer pressure, gender socialization, and I think I already mentioned peer pressure. So it's undisputed that people of color are grossly overrepresented in our criminal justice system. The book using 2017 crime stats illustrates this. They talk about how African Americans, who make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population, account for 52% of homicide arrests, 37% of all violent crime arrests, and their incarceration rate is 7 times that of whites. They talk about Hispanics, who make up roughly 18% of the U.S. population, account for 23% of violent crime arrests, and that their incarceration is 3.4 times that of whites. Again, totally undisputed numbers. The big question is why are these numbers the way they are? Sociologists, as it says on the screen, dispute the reasons behind this. So when looking at these clear disparities in the criminal justice system, sociologists and criminologists have a lively debate on what the meaning of these numbers are and what is the cause. There are those that will argue that the numbers are primarily the result of racial and ethnic bias within the criminal justice system. And then there are others that will cite other factors. The book presents some. They talk about how people of color tend to live in poverty more often, tend to live in urban areas, which are more likely to be policed heavily than more rural areas, have less access to employment, have more residential insecurity, have more family disruption, and generally tend to be more hopeless in their life outcome. I think probably the truth is both, that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and both these are factors. Interestingly, about a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks, Harvard University released a study commissioned by the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, who ironically died midweek last week, just after this study he commissioned was published. They found that people of color were having significantly disparate outcomes in the court system in Massachusetts, which I think was a little bit of a shock to a lot of people in the court system. I know some prosecutors were making comments on Facebook about the study. People in the court system tend to hold themselves up as above the fray, and I think that they were a little shocked of some of the things Harvard University found. So they looked primarily at weapons in drug cases and the outcome. They found that people of color tended to have more serious initial charges based on the fact patterns of the crimes, which severely puts people at a disadvantage. The more serious the crimes you're charged with, the less ability you have in a plea bargain with the prosecutor. Also implicit, it seemed, in this is that they thought prosecutors may be actually changing the charges or bringing more serious charges after the police had gone with whatever they bring. I know there's been occasions where we have, in a fairly serious case, have sat down and had a serious discussion about what we're charging with them, and maybe looked at a more serious crime and decided that We didn't think it was appropriate. It's gone to court, and we get the charging sheet back after the arraignment and find that they decided to go with a more serious charge. I mean, sometimes they will decrease the seriousness of charges or do away with charges, but I find it's more frequently that sometimes the charges have been upped, especially more serious cases. They found that black people were 8 times more likely to be sentenced to state prison than white people, and Hispanics 5 times more likely than whites. These are 2014 statistics. It might be interesting to see how that compares in 2017 with the federal statistics. Also involved in this is lawyers. I mean, the access to a well-trained lawyer, and a lawyer you're paying for, as opposed to a lawyer that is appointed, especially in areas which actually use a public defender system. The low-tier lawyer you're paying for out of your pocket tends to be more experienced than a public defender. That actually is not as prevalent here in Western Massachusetts, where we more use the bar advocate system, where lawyers in private practice will maybe 1 day a week be bar advocates. So you're generally getting the same quality of lawyer. Obviously, they're not getting paid as well, and may not be able to access some of the other stuff they may be in the regular private practice, maybe an investigator, or in the amount of time they can put into that case is probably limited. So I also think that is definitely a factor here. All right, so you're going to see this graph on page 51. Your text shows in the 25 years from 1991 to 2016 that both violent and property crimes have significantly decreased. Criminologists really don't know why this occurred. So the authors of the book give us 4 reasons they think could be responsible for the significant decreases in crime rates in that 25-year period. The 4th one here kind of was intriguing to me. I've never really thought of this. It's having grown up through the lead paint era, I guess we'll call it. I never really thought of this. Paint used to contain lead, especially inside of houses. Unfortunately, it tends to chip, and then little kids will come along and eat it. Lead definitely has been shown to decrease brain development. So never thought of that one, but that's probably a good one. Not sure whether I like how the book puts the decline in crack gang wars. That can kind of go both ways. Yes, there was a significant increase in violent crime surrounding the sale of crack cocaine in the 80s. As I've said before, it's definitely nowhere near as bad as the media presented it as the crack cocaine epidemic. Yes, it happened in a smaller group of large cities, and in reality it was also limited to very small geographic tracts within those cities, a small percentage. Like Los Angeles is this huge area, and the violent crime was limited to 4 or 5 sections of the city that didn't really make up maybe 10%. I'm spitballing it there. It could be 5, could be 10, maybe 15 at the max. Very small geographic areas, so it wasn't as big a problem as the media presented it. It's also tied into number 1, the crack cocaine epidemic kind of was one of the big drivers of the get tough approach of the 80s and 90s, mostly under President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy. She was a big drug or anti-drug crusader at the time. So the get tough approach definitely put a lot of people in jail, some rightly, some wrongly. It also changed the definition of a bunch of crimes, created a bunch of new crimes, which certainly increased our crime rates. And what I think is probably the largest driver of this, not a criminologist, but if you have a smaller number of people available to commit crimes in the age group that are most likely to commit crimes, young males between 15 and say 25, you're going to have less crimes. Having said that, other countries that didn't necessarily have some of the other drivers, Canada and other developed European countries also saw the same decreases in crime rates. They certainly didn't have, in Canada, large crack cocaine incidents going on. They didn't have get tough in crime like we did in the United States. The birth rates are actually down worldwide in most developed countries, so that could still be a driver. So the short version is criminologists really don't have a complete explanation, which is usually the situation in complex problems. You can say, well, this is the thing. In reality, the truth is probably a whole bunch of factors, and sometimes the trick is figuring out exactly how much each factor is contributing to what we're seeing. All right, so the book moves on to theories of why people commit crime or why people don't commit crime. I'm going to be kind of brief about these. You're going to go into a lot of detail when you take criminology. Some of these I'll talk a little bit about because I think there's some of the more important theories that might help you going forward. The first theory the book presents is rational choice. Theory, very simply, people of their own free will analyze the potential rewards, what they could get out of committing a crime, and the risks of getting punished. I'm a firm believer that most people have a price at which they would commit a crime. Personally, my price is probably somewhere in the $100 million range. I severely doubt that I would find a crime where I could get $100 million and be able to analyze the risks and say, you know, it's worth it, but I think everybody has a price. Deterrence theory is the idea that people are deterred from committing a crime by the possible punishments. A great example of this is the death penalty. The theory behind the death penalty, at least part of it, is that people won't commit a murder because the state will put them to death. That's kind of been debunked. Even though specific deterrence has shown some effect, routine activities theory, kind of, I don't know if you guys took SAFE and you learned the triangle of fire. So basically the theory here is that for a crime to occur, three things have to happen. And if you remove one of the three, crime does not happen. First, you have to have someone willing to commit a crime. That is the motivated offender. The second is a attractive target, whether that's something to be stolen, a person to be killed, mugged, whatever. And the third is the absence, they call it absence of guardianship, in the form of potential witness, civilians, or police, or someone who can't come to the aid or protect the victim. There's a theory called crime prevention by environmental design, which is kind of tied into this theory, where if you harden the target, you put up cameras or something like that, or change the design of thing to prevent crime, that falls under routine activities theory. So the book presents 4 biological explanations on why people are more likely to commit crimes. Genes and heredity. Short version is people are born more likely to commit crimes. One of the pieces of evidence proponents of this theory cite are identical twins tend to have similar crime rates. That probably ignores a whole bunch of socialization and environment where identical twins tend to like grow up together, have the same life experiences together. So probably that's not as strong a piece of evidence. There used to be the super male theory that a male was born with an extra, I forget whether it's an X or a Y chromosome. So it's either they were XXY or XYY. I forget which one. They were supposedly the super male predators. That's kind of been debunked. Higher testosterone levels or hormones in the person's body tend to make them more aggressive and violent. This is kind of been borne out in studies of people that have taken anabolic steroids. They tend to have extreme aggressive and violent behaviors. Complications of childbirth. We now know that a pregnant woman should not be smoking, doing alcohol, doing other drugs. When I was born, that information was not readily out there. There were children born with what was called fetal alcohol syndrome. We still see today kids that are born addicted to all kinds of opiates. They tend to have lower birth weight, and all of these things tend to limit the oxygen to a child's brain. So it at least impairs their brain development. Childhood toxic stress is more environment related in the child's upbringing, whether it's domestic violence is something that child sexual assault, just what kids are exposed to in their early lives. So the book gives us two psychological explanations for crime. One is the psychoanalytical view, focuses on the work of Sigmund Freud, and says that basically crime results from a clash between a person's needs and society's expectations, and how the id, superego, and ego clash. Kind of the criticism on this, as it says, is that kind of is more relevant in children, adults not so much. Personality problems breaks down to basically poor parenting and bad experiences as a child, leads to criminal activity and other issues as an adult. So we get the sociologists' explanations for crime. The first is basically because somebody grows up in a poor neighborhood and exposed to crime, that it becomes normal for them, kind of a classist view on the world. Second is blocked opportunity, because people grow up in crime. They tend to become angry and commit crime. Again, a little very classist. The second is the work of Merton and his anome theory. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Because no matter how hard people work at being successful, because they have poor schooling, poor experiences, lack of parenting, maybe not great education in lower income areas, they become frustrated with their lack of opportunity in spite of their work, and then they commit crime. So here we have differential association theory and peer influence or learning theories that kind of shows kind of peer pressure, to put it simply, that people learn crime from their associates. Definitely something I believe on. Social bonding theory is closely associated that if especially juveniles have an important role model in their life that is demonstrating good behaviors, they tend to be less likely to commit crimes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, it could be a family member, a teacher, or someone else in their environment, scout leader, someone at the YMCA, or something like that. Self-control theory basically says that people can't follow the rules because they're unable or they have no self-control. So labeling theory is kind of interesting to me. It basically says that once somebody gets marked as something, in this case a criminal, people are going to start to perceive them as that, and that they themselves will perceive themselves as that. So they will start, if they have been labeled as a criminal, they will start acting like a criminal. And on the other side, that people, because they've been labeled a criminal, will tend to treat them that way, maybe not give them the support they've been giving them before. Conflict theory basically says that the ruling class uses law to oppress the poor or the people that aren't in favor, and crime results from that class rising up to some extent. All right, so the book takes about half a page to talk about what they call feminist views of crime. I think it's a fairly poor treatment of the subject. Maybe when we have more time later in the semester, it's something we can talk about, because it's kind of a fascinating area on how this actually plays out. They talk about how research finds that crime committed by women have the same roots as male crime. Still doesn't explain, as it says here, why females commit less serious crime than males, especially in the area of violent crime. Men are so much more likely to commit a violent crime. I think that probably has to do with expected gender roles in society, even in the year 2020. I think that's probably a definite factor there. Talks about how women are more likely to be victims of crime as far as sexual crimes and domestic violence, and how sometimes being victims brings them into a situation where they become perpetrators of crime. This is particular in the area of domestic violence, where abused women at some point will use violence to defend themselves. And if you don't have well-trained police officers in the area of predominant aggressor or primary aggressor, they've changed the name on that, and being able to analyze that, they can be arrested when they're actually acting in self-defense. It's an area I've done a decent amount of research. That's what I wrote my master's theory is on, that policies around predominant aggressor, and how well police are trained, or how poorly in some circumstances police are trained on that, and how those policies are formulated or poorly formulated sometimes. They also talk about how women are treated in the criminal justice system. Women tend to be arrested more as adolescents, but as they become adults, they commit less crimes or less arrested. Also talks about how women are more likely to be apprehended for status type crimes than males. Talks a little bit about how men are treated in the system, and how they are less likely to be arrested for committing the same crimes, which is my experience. I think police officers are definitely less likely to arrest women for committing the same offense. I think that's partially gender role related. It also can be how they act or react to their being confronted by the authorities. I think those are both important factors from my personal experience. So the book in the last, right at the end of the chapter, takes about half a page, talks about some policy considerations. I'm going to let you guys read most of that. I'm just going to leave it up on the screen. So just two slides on how each can be addressed from that discipline's point of view. So it wasn't until the 1970s that criminologists and other people in the field started looking at the victims of crime, and mostly came about as a result of the women's rights movement and victims of crime movement. It's kind of interesting that it seems like we're actually going backwards. There's been a lot of pushback against victims' rights, and it seems like the rights of victims are being eroded daily in our system. So they created this theory of victimology. It's basically the study of the effects of being a crime victim. So when we talk about the demographics of crime victims, we will see that the numbers closely mirror what we already know for offender rates. Young people are a lot more likely to be victims of serious violent crimes and homicides, very closely mirroring what we saw with offender data. Males account for 3/4 of all homicide victims. Females account for 4/5 of all rapes and sexual assaults. Males have a slightly higher victimization rate than females for simple assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. So this graph from page 72, I'm just showing the breakdown as far as crime victimization in various age groups. A little bit surprised that the 25 to 34 age group. I figured the 18 to 24 would be higher. I am wondering if you looked 30 to 34, what their rate was. I mean, I think you would see it heading down to for the 35 to 49 age group. So when you look at race and ethnicity and crime victimization rates, you see a lot of the same disparities we talked about and saw. We talked about the arrest data for violent crimes. The book tells us that 43% of all homicide victims are African American, where African Americans make up between 13 and 14% of the national population. This section of the book says 14. When we talked about arrests, they said 13. Looked at the census data. Depending on how you do the math, it's either 13.5, 13.6 when I did a quick Google search. Latinos, who are 18% of the national population, account for 22% of the homicide victims, with a little bit of star on there. That data is only for locations which provided ethnicity data. Ethnicity is a subset of race. Latinos are reported as white, and then their ethnicity is brought in, and some police departments don't report that data. When you look at the self-reporting data, African Americans and Latinos report a significantly higher rate of victimization as far as serious violent crimes. If you look at Native Americans, they are reporting being victims of violent crimes at twice the rate of any other ethnic group. Immigrants are another group that report higher victimization rates. Several reasons for this. The first is that offenders tend to know that they are less likely to report due to possible language barriers or just fear of dealing with the police. It could be they're in fear of getting deported, or where they come from. The police are really, really bad, and no one wants to deal with the police, and they're really corrupt. There's also anti-immigrant prejudice, as we've seen in several locations, and these are obviously major factors on why recent immigrants to the United States tend not to report crimes and are easy marks for criminals. Social class, victimization along economic lines is very, very interesting. The disparities are amazing. So this chart is from page 73 of your book. They talk about wealthy people. If you look at the middle right here, $25,000 household income is nothing at all. But there's a significant 10% decrease from at that $25,000 a year threshold. In reality, at $75,000, which is a decent living, it's only a 5% drop for $50,000 worth of income. So a lot of crime fear is driven by stranger crime. Yes, statistically, a person is more likely to be victimized by a stranger than a non-stranger, but it's a very thin percentage. In fact, a lot of crimes are committed majority by non-strangers. We talk about sexual assaults and rapes. Only 1/5 are committed by strangers. We spend a lot of time and a lot of money on like sex offender registries, when the reality is that an overwhelming majority of sex crimes are committed by people who are known to the victim or have access to the victim. You look at child sexual assault, it's almost always a family member, somebody that has access to the child, whether it's a daycare provider, Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts, the Girls Club, the YMCA. So this is another chart from your book. Kind of interestingly, you look at the rape numbers from men to women. Only 18% of sexual assaults and rapes of women are committed by strangers. That's 82% are people known to them. Just staggering numbers. So two more slides on this section. The cost of being a victim of crime is $20 billion a year. That includes anything that's stolen, damaged property, medical costs, mental health treatment, and earnings from lost work. That's just a staggering number, $20 billion. The book talks about indirect costs to society. People lose productivity from work, cost of medical care, law enforcement. We've already talked to how much our criminal justice system costs. Cost of security systems, we've already talked to that. So they're saying the indirect costs are $450 billion on the low end, and maybe even $3.2 trillion. Just staggering numbers.
All right, so I've run a little bit long. I'm about out of time. So I won't start a new section in the little bit amount of time left, just to end a little bit early. Just remember, we have our weekly Zoom Wednesday, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. And I also have my class-wide Thursday, 6:30 to 7:30. Stop in. We can talk about some of the stuff that's going on in the class. And you never know, maybe even we'll start talking about the exam. I've got some ideas of some of the questions I'm going to put in there. And I've gotten some excellent suggestions for exam questions from you guys. All right. Just make sure you're getting up on your writing assignments and answering and commenting on your peers. I will talk to you guys next week.